So the session tonight is specifically about preparing for interviews. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all the different types of interviews and the different types of questions that you might encounter. But the main focus of this session is on preparing for behavioural interviews. So that's sort of what we're going to focus on. I'm going to talk to you about what is a behavioural question, why companies use this method. But look, this is a great opportunity for you to learn some interview skills, which you can apply from internship, part-time, graduate positions, right through to executive level. This is a great skill to learn at this stage of your career. I really wish that I had known this when I had first started out looking for jobs. And you'd be surprised the number of people that I coach who may have even been working for 10, 15, 20 years who have never learnt this, and they just can't believe that, they realize they've been interviewing and perhaps not getting those jobs, and then they understand why. So this is hopefully something that you can learn and carry with you for a long time. So for those of you who haven't met me before, just I guess to recap, I'm a career and interview coach. I have my own business, and I coach people from, really sort of high school, very senior high school, recent school leavers, right through to executives. And the interview coaching is something that is probably the favorite part of my business, because this process, as I mentioned before, it applies to every level, but it also applies to pretty much every industry. This session today, it doesn't matter if you're in healthcare, whether you're in design, whether you're in accounting or law, these same sorts of questions will come up time and time again. So hopefully you'll all get something out of this. So this is the agenda for today. So first of all, we're going to just talk about the different types of interviews that you might come across, the different types of interview questions that sit within those interviews. We're going to, as I mentioned, focus specifically on behavioural interviews and why companies use this approach and what a typical behavioural interview structure might look like. Then we're going to I'm going to run through sort of examples of behavioural interview questions, and we're going to talk about a method which we call the STAR method. And this is the recommended way and the expected way that you would answer these questions. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you use that method correctly. Then we're going to sort of finish up with talking about how to prepare best for these interviews. And also I'm going to run through an example STAR response, just so you get a feel for how to structure these types of examples, where to put the emphasis in your stories, and how you might articulate that. First of all, we're going to talk about the different types of interviews that you might get. And this, sometimes with recruitment processes, you will get maybe 2 or 3 of these types of interviews in for one job. I've been through interview processes in the past. There was one job that I went for many years ago, and there were 8 steps in the recruitment process. And there were probably about 6 different interviews that were a variety of formal interviews, coffee meetings, one-on-ones. So, and as graduates, or if you're applying for internships or graduates, there's a fair chance that you may experience even 2 or 3 of these different types of interviews in your lead up to apply for one job. So the first one is the phone screen. So this can happen when you're not really expecting it. And so often what happens, you've submitted your resume for an application, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, you get a phone call from a recruiter who starts asking you questions. And so usually the phone screen is really, I guess, to just screen candidates out based on some key criteria. So for example, if they are recruiting for graduates, then they might have a criteria that you must be an Australian permanent resident. So that would be possibly a question that they might ask you. They might ask you about what location you're willing to work in. So for example, if you live in Melbourne and the job is in Sydney, they might just want to clarify that, you are actually aware that the job is in Sydney and that you're actually willing to relocate, rather than them wasting their time, going through with the recruitment process. So often they might ask you, for example, if the job requires specific Excel skills or specific skills like using the Adobe suite, they might ask you for examples of when you've used those sort of systems. So again, it's just a way of perhaps screening out people who really don't meet the criteria for the role. Now, I guess my one piece of advice is often when people get these calls, they're not really in a position to be discussing this openly. They might be at the checkout at the supermarket. They might be at the beach with their friends. They might be next to a busy road with trams going past. So don't feel like, if you get this call out of the blue, don't feel like you have to answer these questions straight away. Okay, so if you're in a position where you're not really able to talk properly, I would always just say, look, I'm actually on a really busy road. I'm finding it hard to hear you. Would you mind if you call me back in 20 minutes or half an hour when I'm in a better position to talk? Okay, so you don't want to sort of blow your chances by being put on the spot and not being able to really hear them properly or answer these questions, because they also are, this screening process is also about assessing your communication skills. So that might be the first step in the process. Sometimes interviews, particularly say for an internship, or if your interview has been organised by someone that you know. So for example, if you have a parent who works at a company and they're able to organise a little bit of a potential internship, you might be called in to have a really casual meeting with the hiring manager. So this might be in their office, it might be downstairs in a coffee shop, or it might be a Zoom interview. So often they'll say, look, you don't really need to prepare. This is just going to be a casual chat. So again, my first piece of advice would be treat it like a formal interview. I would still anticipate the types of questions that you're going to get and prepare what sort of responses you might use in those situations. You certainly don't want to just rock up for a coffee and expect that they're not going to ask you any questions. The other trap with this type of interview is often people will let their guard down and maybe be a little bit too honest about things. Okay, so sometimes in a casual interview, you still want to treat it like a formal interview. And when I say let your guard down, for example, you don't want to tell them you've applied for 25 other jobs with their competitors. You do want them to feel quite special and that you have chosen them and that you really want to work for them. So always treat those casual interviews still like it's a bit more of a formal interview. So then we get down to sort of the real type of interview. And this could be you meeting with one or two other people, or you might have a panel interview where you might have 3 or even 4 people on a panel. So at the moment, a lot of interviews are online. So a panel interview would be actually very similar to what we're doing now. You would be looking into the screen and there'd be 3 or 4 people that you can see at the top. Or, ideally we'll be returning to face-to-face and you'll actually meet them in person. So a panel interview is usually a much more formal interview. And the idea behind this is to assess your relevant experience, any particular skills that they're looking for, and that includes technical and soft skills. But they're also looking to assess your motivations. Why do you really want to work for us? Why do you want to work in this industry? And finally, they're looking to see, will you fit in? So really at the end of the day, every interview, they want to know, can you do the job? Do you want the job? And will you fit in? Okay, and so when I say, will you fit in, do you behave and do things the way that we would expect and the way that we do them in our company? Are you a team player? Will you fit into the team? Will you do things in accordance with the values of our company? So most companies, their values are things like collaboration, integrity, respect, inclusion. Okay, so one key thing you always need to do before you go to an interview is look at the values on the website and think about how you can incorporate some of that language and how you can demonstrate that you do demonstrate those values in your current work. Now, usually this interview will be a behavioural interview, and I'm going to go into a little more detail in a minute and explain exactly what that is. And on this panel, it's quite likely that you might have someone who is like the hiring manager. So for example, you're interviewing with a law firm You are likely to have one person on the panel who might be a partner in a particular area of the firm. You're likely to have an HR person, so that might be a graduate recruitment manager, and then there could be sort of an independent third party. So when I say that, it might be someone like another partner or another manager who works in the firm, could be in that area that they're interviewing you for, or it could be from someone else in a different part of the organisation. So what they're looking for is to have, I guess, people who can assess your technical skills and your experience, but also your soft skills. Now, another type of interview is what we call the group interview or a group assessment. This type of interview is very common in graduate programs where you are applying for internships or graduate positions. It's also very common for retail jobs, jobs in hospitality or call centres, or in jobs like the emergency services like police, firefighting, ambulance. And so this type of group interview, there's a number of different tasks that you're usually required to complete. And the reason that they have this interview is, again, to try and reduce the time that it takes to screen people out of the process, particularly graduate programs where you've got, hundreds, if not thousands of applicants. The first cut might be a pre-recorded video interview where you have to answer questions into a screen. And the next cut might be, or the next step might be, a group interview. So for instance, they might bring 10 of you online or into their office, and you will have a number of different tasks over possibly 2 hours, a half day, or even a full day. So the types of tasks you might get, you might be asked to do a written exercise, or like almost like a comprehension exercise. So for example, they might give you a brochure on solar panels or something from a government department, and you might have a time limit. You might have 5 minutes to read that document, to summarize it, and then present it back to the group. So that might be sort of a presentation task. You might be asked to do a written task, and then you might be asked to do role plays. And they're particularly common in call centre environments, hospitality, and retail jobs. Then the other type of activity you might get asked to do is to work on a scenario, work on a problem as a group. Okay, and so to give you an example of this, a couple of my clients recently had an activity where they were told there was 10 of them in the activity. They were survivors of a plane crash, and they had a list of about 30 or 40 pieces of equipment and materials. And as a group, they had to decide which 10 pieces of equipment that they could carry or would carry. And so obviously the idea of this is to observe you working as part of a team. And there's certain behaviours that they're looking for. So they're observing you to see if you're a team player. They're observing you to see how you communicate ideas, whether you're able to influence people with your ideas. They're looking for examples of inclusion. And so the way that you might do that would be perhaps to refer to people in the group or bring people into the conversation who are perhaps a little bit quieter and aren't really saying much. So it might be saying, Laura, I know that you've got a background in this, do you have any good ideas that we can incorporate? So they're looking for these behaviours that would demonstrate that you would fit into that organisation and into that team. And you will be assessed from the minute you walk in the door. So if you're going to an office to do this, it's, how do you, when you first walk in the room, are you friendly? Are you approachable? Do you remember people's names? Do you make an effort to introduce yourself? So they're looking out for all those sorts of behaviours. And then often these group assessments, you might have an interview later in the day. So as you can imagine, should be a fun day, but it can be quite sort of a full-on day. And often these group activities, there can be someone in the group who sort of sabotages the group and tries to take over. Do not be that person. So if you are a competitive person, try and not let the competition get the better of you. Just try and collaborate and work with others rather than competing against others. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what that might look like. And then we've got the video interview. So most interviews at the moment will be on video. You still need to look professional. It's important that you have good body language. So even those group assessments, you want to be taking notes. You want to be, sitting up, not, obviously checking your phone or anything like that. So you want to always be engaged with what's going on. You want to have good lighting. So preferably you want to be looking towards a light. So that might be open window with natural light, or you might have a ring light or something on your desk that puts light on your face. Be careful of your camera angle as well. I did a coaching session with a guy the other day whose camera was right up here, and I felt like I was like an elf on a shelf looking down at him the whole time, and he was sort of looking up at me. So just, make sure that you've got your camera angle. So sometimes you don't realize that that's how it comes across. And most importantly, practice your tech setup. I had a client earlier this week who he had a group assessment, and he basically missed it because he couldn't get his MS Teams to work. So you definitely don't want to be one of those people. You definitely want to have that all sorted. So different types of questions that you might get in an interview. So this is, I guess, going back to those more formal behavioural interviews. So the first type of questions would be what I call general questions. Okay, so these are the types of questions that are pretty universal. They're questions that are warm-up questions to get to know you. And so the most common ones would be, tell us a little bit about yourself, or can you take us through your resume and tell us, some of the highlights? Do you know anything about our company? Do you know anyone who works here? They might ask you about strengths and weaknesses, or, why should we hire you? So these are probably your top 5 most common questions. And so I would encourage you to go away and definitely create a bit of a script for each of these and practice it. Particularly tell us about yourself, because that's usually the first question. So you definitely want them to show that you're prepared. You definitely want to tell them information that is relevant to the job. I would give them a little bit of an overview of your background, mostly probably focusing on your study and why you chose that course. You might talk a little bit about what parts of the course you enjoyed most, and why perhaps you've decided to pursue this particular career path. You could focus a little bit on some part-time work or some internship experiences that you've had, and talk about, I guess, the skills that you've developed in your part-time work or in your internships that will help you in this job. If you do some things outside of study, so you might play sport, or you might be in an orchestra or do drama, definitely include a little bit about what you do outside of work, because that shows them that you do have extracurricular interests that you will be easy to send out to clients to have a chat, because you'll have things to talk about. But you don't need to go into too much detail about your personal life. You don't need to tell them where you live, or how many pets you have, or how many siblings you've got. Like, just think about what is relevant to the job. So these would be the most common general questions. And then the next type of question are what we call sort of more the understanding your motivations. So as I mentioned before, one of the key things they're assessing is, do you really want this job? It might sound a little bit, you might sort of assume, well, of course I want it because I've applied for it. But if you're a graduate and you've applied for 30 graduate positions, they'll be able to see through that. So you really want to show them that you have chosen their organisation, and to give them some reasons why you've applied. So for example, I was working with a graduate today. She's a landscape architect, and she's got an interview coming up this week. And so she'd found some projects that the person that was interviewing her, she'd been able to find some information online about certain projects that he worked on that really resonated with her and what she's interested in. So looking for some examples of work that the company's doing. LinkedIn's obviously a great way to research and keep track of that. But I guess, really showing that you've got a genuine interest in working for that particular company, and maybe even within that particular team. Other questions might be around your career goals or where you see yourself in 5 to 10 years. And the reason that question is asked, I guess, is to assess, are you realistic about where you'll be in that time? So, perhaps don't tell them that you're going to be the CEO in 5 years' time. And also don't tell them, I'm looking to work for a couple of years and then I'm going to go traveling. Because if they're going to invest in you and train you, then they probably want you to stay a little bit longer than that. And I'm sure some of you are planning on doing that. So I guess it's sort of thinking about what they want to hear and, realistically where you would see yourself in that time period. So then we get situational interview questions. Now, these aren't as common anymore because they've been replaced by behavioural interviews. But these questions are really focusing on how you would handle a particular scenario. So it's more generic. It's more, what would you do in this situation? So over the last decade, probably these questions have been replaced by behavioural questions, because behavioural questions are more about asking for an example of how you've done that in the past, and they're more evidence-based, where these would be more generic. Now, if you are asked a behavioural interview question and you need to provide an example and you really don't have one, then the other way, I guess, of handling this would be say what you think you would do in that situation. But ideally, you will have an example for all the behavioural questions, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So these are situational, definitely less likely and less common in interviews these days. Okay, and so now we get into behavioural interview questions. So behavioural interview questions are sometimes also called competency-based questions. So the whole idea of these questions is that past behaviour is the best way to predict future performance or future behaviour. So the whole idea of these questions is that they ask you for a very specific example, or a story really is all it is, of how you have used a particular competency in the past to see how you would behave in that situation. And obviously that is reassuring to them that, yes, she has dealt with this type of situation before, and she has dealt with it in the way that we would expect of someone working at that level in our organisation. How will you recognise this sort of question? So this type of question, they will always ask you for an example or a story. So they will usually start, or pretty much always will start with, tell us about a time when, describe a situation when, or give us an example of. Okay, so whenever you hear a question that is asked, a method called the STAR method, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to answer this question. The key to these responses is that you need a very specific story or example. Okay, we don't want to talk about generically what we do in situations. We want to tell them that, yes, I have an example. It comes from this time working at this organization. This is what happened. This is how I dealt with it. And this was the result. Okay, so the key is to be very specific. And I think this is what most people struggle with, is they're not sure how specific to be. And so that's why I'm going to show you an example towards the end of this presentation to give you an idea of how detailed it needs to be. A typical interview structure, so they might even send out an email to you and invite you to an interview. Some companies will tell you it's a behavioural interview, and they might even suggest that you prepare using the STAR method. Others will just say, come to this interview at this date. Okay, so this is often the way they would structure this sort of interview, starting off with some general questions, again, to warm you up, get a feel for you as a person. Can you communicate? Are you motivated to join us for the right reasons? And then they might get into some more behavioural type questions, or asking you questions about certain values. Behavioural questions, they are linked to key skills, but they can also be asked about certain values. Behavioural questions might be linked to things like teamwork, to communication skills, to problem-solving skills, initiative, time management, conflict resolution. So they're the sort of questions that you'll get. Tell us about a time when you've resolved a conflict, or give us an example of a time when you've had conflicting deadlines, or describe a situation when you had to change the way you communicate to be understood. So these questions will usually be linked to a competency, but they also could be linked to a value. So for, an example of that might be, can you tell us about a time when you've worked with someone from a different background to you and how you demonstrated that you were inclusive? Okay, that's quite a hard one. Or they might say, can you tell us about a time when you've demonstrated respect? So always look at the values. Often the values, as I've mentioned before, are around collaboration, respect, integrity. So I'd always prepare some examples for those as well. So often they'll start off with the general questions, then they'll ask you some behavioural questions, then they will invite you to ask some questions. So I would always recommend going in with 2 to 3 questions, ideally open questions that will get them talking about the team, about some projects they're working on. At the end of the interview, you want to ideally just be able to relax and just have a conversation. So try and avoid closed questions that will just shut down the conversation. You could even ask them, I noticed on LinkedIn that you've been here since you were a graduate and have been here for 10 years. What do you enjoy about working for BHP? So feel like you can ask them some personal questions, what they like about the firm or what they like about the projects that they work on. Or you could just ask them general questions about training, about the graduate program, etc. And then the final part is obviously when you finish the interview, and I'd always recommend that you practice closing the interview and what you're going to say at the end. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. Once you know what the structure is, the next thing is really being able to anticipate the types of questions you're going to get. So most people that come to see me for interview coaching, they find that interviews are very stressful. Often they've got quite really feel very negative about going to interviews. I personally think that it all comes down to preparation. Okay, so if you've identified the types of competencies they're going to assess, then you can anticipate the types of questions you're going to get, and you can go away and prepare examples and practice them. Okay, so it's like turning up to anything. If you have to do a speech at school or a speech at university, you're going to practice it and prepare beforehand. You don't just turn up and wing it on the day. So interviews are no different. It does take a lot of preparation and a lot of time to get it right. But the stress, I believe, comes from not, doing the preparation beforehand. So the first thing is we're going to understand the competencies required for the job. And usually this is quite obvious so for example, if you're applying for a graduate program or a position that's advertised in the advertisement or in the position description, at some point they will say, we're looking for people who meet this criteria, or we're looking for people like this. The competencies will be things like, we're looking for a team player. Okay, so I need a teamwork example. We're looking for someone who has initiative to improve processes. Okay, well, I need an initiative example. So I would always go through the ad with a highlighter and highlight the things they're looking for, and that will help you work out what examples you need. So first of all, you're going to identify what competencies are required for the job, and then you're going to go away and research the questions. So usually there's lots of information on Google. You can Google teamwork questions or behavioural questions. If you want, you can go to my website, which is relaunchme. There is a tab called, I think it's called Fun Stuff. And under that, it's got freebies. And from the freebies section, you can download a document that I've put together that's 100 behavioural questions you need to know. So you will never get 100 behavioural questions, but it's a good way to get a feel for how they can ask questions in different ways. So for example, to assess your teamwork skills, they could ask that question 10, 15 different ways. So they might say, can you tell us about a time when you've worked in a team? Can you describe a situation when you've made a positive contribution to a team? Can you tell us about a time when you've motivated a team? Can you tell us about a time when you've worked in a functional team or a dysfunctional team? Can you tell us about a time when you helped a colleague? Okay, so you can already see there, like that's what 8 different ways of assessing your teamwork skills. So the more you get used to reading these questions, then you can it helps you identify what that question's actually assessing, because they may not always use the word teamwork. So to give you an example, I remember my graduate interview, which was a long time ago. I was asked a question, and the question was, tell us about a time when you've been misunderstood. And I had no idea what they were talking about. I could not think of anything, and I just wanted the ground to swallow me up. But what they were asking me is an example of my communication skills. So another way of asking that question would be, tell us about a time when you had to adapt your communication style to be understood. Okay, and so I was applying for a role, an accounting role. It was in taxation, and taxation is quite a complex area. So what they were trying to understand is, would I be able to explain something complex that's tax related and to be able to communicate that to a non-tax person in a simple way. So that's what they were getting at, but I didn't know that. So sometimes they may not necessarily use the word communication. You need to really listen to the question and say, well, what is the skill that they're actually testing here? So you're going to go and research the questions, and then you're going to go away and prepare these STAR examples, which we're going to talk about. And then you practice them. You write them out and you practice them over and over again. Okay, so behavioural competency, and so I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but I just want to explain, I've talked about competencies, and basically a competency is just a skill. And the competencies that they're going to test are more the soft skills. Okay, so they're not going to say to you, tell us about a time when you've used Excel to write a formula. Okay, it's more about the soft skills that sit around your technical skills. They might still ask you about, have you used Excel, but it's not going to be a behavioural interview question. So what happens with these competencies is, in these big corporates and government departments, so these are used in the public and the private sector, human resources develop what we call a competency framework. And so the whole idea of this competency framework is that they use it for recruitment and they use it for performance management. So basically what they say is, okay, for all our staff across our whole organisation, we want people who are team players, we want people who are good communicators, we want people who demonstrate leadership, we want people who are good problem solvers. And then as you become more senior, there would be additional competencies like staff management or change management. So basically what happens is they have a document that looks something like this. Okay, so this is an example of a competency framework from a government department. And so you can see here that under each of these columns, which are sort of the competencies, they've got sub-competencies. And all of those bullet points are the expected behaviours that sit under that competency. Basically, what I'm saying is they've got teamwork in mind as a competency, and under teamwork, there's certain behaviours that they want to hear, that they're listening out for. And so the key is that in our STAR examples, we want to demonstrate to them that we demonstrate the behaviours they're looking for. So I hope that sort of makes some sort of sense. But basically, when these big companies are recruiting, they're using documents like this. And that's why it's really important to not only understand the competency of teamwork, but to think about, well, what are the behaviours that sit under that? We're going to sort of talk through that in a little bit more detail now. So you've had a look through the position description, you've highlighted the keywords and the competencies, and the types of things they're looking for, as I mentioned, leadership, teamwork, conflict resolution, etc. So to give you an example, say you are going for a job, it might even be a part-time job, anything that's customer service focused. So the types of skills or competencies that would be assessed would be, do you actually demonstrate good customer service skills? Are you able to adapt your communication when dealing with the public? Are you also, if it's a job that requires you to write, they might ask you for an example of where you've had to adapt your written communication for a particular audience. If you are dealing with the public and you have to deal with complaints, this question comes up all the time, but they will often ask you, do you have an example of when you've had to resolve a conflict? If it's a job that's quite busy, which most jobs are these days, tell us about a time when you've demonstrated or had to use your time management skills. So the customer service roles, these are sort of typical competencies that would be under that job. If it's more of, say a technical job like engineering, obviously communication is just as important and teamwork, but there might also be some competencies around attention to detail, or your problem solving skills, or being results focused, or your project management skills. So the competencies will vary job to job depending on obviously what's required of the role. So let's just talk about, we've talked about sort of the competency. Let's use teamwork as an example to understand this is the competency is teamwork, and what are the desired actions and behaviours. And look, I always say to people that I'm coaching, that doesn't matter what team you're in. It could be a footy team, it could be a netball team, it could be a team of engineers. Really, at the end of the day, the behaviours are the same. Okay, so people want to work with someone who shares information with the team, that they might ask for ideas from the team and ask for feedback. They might be happy to give feedback to the team. They're regularly communicating with the team. They're offering assistance to their colleagues, particularly if they need a bit of extra support. They might be bringing the team together to make sure everyone's working towards a common goal. They might have a good understanding of different strengths and weaknesses in the team. So it's sort of thinking, okay, well, teamwork is what they want. What are the sort of behaviours that sit under teamwork? And when has there been a time where I've demonstrated those behaviours? So you could use an example from a group assignment at uni. It could be an example of working in a part-time job. And often the best examples are where perhaps things aren't going well. Okay, so the best examples for these star examples are usually perhaps where maybe there's some problems in the team. Maybe the team is not communicating. If you're working on a group assignment and no one is sharing information, no one knows what their role and responsibilities are, there's no common objectives. Often I hear from clients where they're in a group assignment, someone's aiming for an A+ and someone else in the team's aiming for a C or a B, and they don't really care about their mark. So there's no common goal. Maybe there's nowhere to share information. There's no Google Docs set up. And so you set that up to help the team. So think about an example for teamwork, perhaps where, the team's not effective, and think about the things that you might have done to improve things in the team or to help other team members. I've talked about, brainstorming examples. The next thing is to really think about which example's the best. Okay, so if you've got to organize, you need an example for teamwork, I would, write down teamwork on a page and just brainstorm all the different examples that you can think of. And then think, okay, well, which one can I get the most behaviours out of? Like, which one is a proper story that I can talk about? Ideally, you want to be using fairly recent examples. So if you're someone who is more senior in your career, if you are, say, 30 and you're using an example from, first year uni, then that would raise a red flag. Well, haven't you worked in a team or helped a team in the last 8 years? So I would always recommend examples that are maybe 2 or 3, 2 years old, ideally. No, don't go too far back. So think about, I guess, the example a recent example, because it's easy to remember as well, and an example that you feel, I guess, might be relevant to the work that you're applying for. Sometimes people don't have examples that are relevant. So For example, if you're applying for a job in architecture, but you've only worked in retail or customer service, that's totally fine. So you don't have to have an example from working in the same industry. What's most important is that you're demonstrating the right behaviours. But if you do have an example that's relevant, then by all means use that. So the next step is, once you know what your example is, we need to write it out using this method called the STAR method. Now, this is expected. So if you don't use this method, it's really hard for them to mark you and you will be disadvantaged. So it's really important that you understand this method and that you really try and structure your stories using this particular STAR method. So this is what STAR looks like. Now, I've put some percentages there. They're kind of rough percentages, so don't take that too literally. But basically, the STAR method is an acronym. So STAR is an acronym. S is describe the situation. So what we want to know is, where were you when this story happened? Who were you working for? What happened? So usually, as I mentioned, it's some sort of problem. Now, the situation is really just setting the scene. Okay, this is where I was working. This is what happened. The task is, what did you know you needed to do to fix that problem? So for example, if we're talking about a teamwork example, the example might be that you're in a group assignment, you've been allocated a group, no one's doing anything. No one's organised any meetings, the deadline's getting closer, there's no communication. I felt that I needed to step in and do something. I needed to, take some action and try and get this team working together. So that's really, the task is, if you're going to leave anything out of STAR, that's the bit that's the least important. It's really just verbalizing what you knew you needed to do. The most important part is always the actions. Okay, and so this is the key to passing these interviews. So you want to talk about, what did you actually do to help this team? So what were the behaviors that you demonstrated? So for example, maybe the first thing you did was organize a meeting to get the team together. You then discussed what the assignment was about and suggested that we break up the work like X, Y, Z. And then I asked for their feedback and to make sure everyone was happy to do it that way. I then set up a Google Doc so that we could all be working off the same document, and suggested that we meet once a week to discuss ideas. So-and-so also had a good idea of doing this. I thought that was a great idea as well. In your actions, it's not about what the team project was. What is important is what you did to help the team. So it's bringing through those behaviors that we talked about before. Now, one thing with your actions that's also very important is they need to be I statements, not we statements. Okay, so we don't want to talk about what the team did. We want to talk about what you did. So rather than saying we had a meeting and decided, you would say, I suggested we have a meeting to discuss X, Y, and Z. What we're interested in is what you did, not what the team did. And then the final bit is the result. And that's, basically, what was the outcome? So because of your good actions, what did you achieve? Did the team start working better together and sharing ideas? Were you able to hand in the assignment early? Did you get the A grade that you were looking for? And, did the team even stay in touch after this because we all communicated and worked well as a team? So think about, I guess, the flow-on effect of the actions that you took and how that helped you and how it helped the greater team. Does anyone have any questions about that method? Because this is probably the most important part. Yeah, Josh. Okay, great. So what are your thoughts on using a notebook or similar to have written STAR examples or questions? I would recommend not having notes, because you want to be, giving them your full attention. You also don't want it to be too robotic. You do want to sound like you're just telling a story. However, if you find it difficult to remember your stories, rather than having them all written down in a notepad, you could have just one page. Okay, so it might be a little bit of a matrix document where you've got teamwork, uni assignment, conflict resolution, Joe at McDonald's. So you could just have some key bullet points maybe next to you. Ideally, I sort of wouldn't be, you don't want to be, I think what happens is when you have your notes there, it's very tempting to be looking down at them. And even interviewing people on virtual, you can sort of tell when they're reading off the screen. Sometimes I've recommended to people who are really struggling that you could put some post-it notes on your screen, but I think that can be distracting as well. So look, I think you've got to do what works for you, but hopefully if you've done enough practice and preparation, you'll pause, you'll listen, you go, okay, that's my teamwork example, and then you can get into it. And look, just remember, like, they don't know exactly what you've prepared. So you miss out on 2 of your actions. Nobody knows.
For sure.
You're getting the general gist across. And, if you don't remember everything, that doesn't really matter. So look, I guess, just a couple of key points. Use relevant examples where you can, and use specific examples. So you definitely don't want to talk generically about how you solve conflicts. You want to choose a conflict about when you worked with Mary at Kentucky Fried and she was bad-mouthing you or something, okay? So you do want to be as specific as you can. And you always want to talk in past tense. So often people kind of blur that, like they're talking about, this is where it happened, and then it suddenly becomes, this is what I do, rather than this is what I did. So your actions always need to be in past tense. You always want to use the STAR method. Now, if you want to, you could give a little introduction before you get into your STAR example that shows your breadth of experience using that skill. Okay, so if you've worked in a number of different part-time jobs, if you've played footy or cricket or basketball, you could say, I've been fortunate to have been part of teams for a long time. I've grown up playing these sports where I really got to understand teamwork from a young age. I've worked in teams in retail. I've worked in teams in my part-time job at McDonald's. And, teamwork is something that I really love being a part of. A specific example that comes to mind of when I worked in a team was XYZ. Okay, so you can give a little bit of an intro. The other thing is, you do want to, when I've got written down here, correct timing. And so I guess what I meant is you want to put the emphasis in the right places. So you want to spend most of your time in the actions. Often people spend way too long talking about the situation, going into a huge amount of detail, and then they kind of skip over the actions to the result. But the actions where you get the marks. Okay, so you definitely want to be talking more about the actions. With these questions, I would sort of aim for about, say, 3 to 4 minutes for your response for a behavioural question. So you can go into a little bit of detail. One thing you need to be careful of, and particularly if you're going for internships or graduate interviews, when there's a video interview at the beginning, and so that's often a pre-recorded interview. So a lot of companies now are doing these pre-recorded interviews where you are timed, okay, and so the computer will ask you a question and you have to answer it within a time limit, okay, and sometimes the time limit might be 2 minutes, which means you don't really have a lot of time to get into your behavioural STAR example. If that is the case, just give them a very succinct, very, 1 or 2 lines for the situation. Spend most of your time in the actions and just summing up your result at the end, because you don't want to sort of get halfway through and get cut off. Hopefully they will send you information. So read the fine print and tell you, you're going to be asked 10 questions. There's going to be this many minutes allocated per question, etc. So make sure you always read the instructions so you know what you're preparing for. So I just want to run through an example with you. So let's say the competency is leadership, and they're looking for, different ways or different examples of when you have demonstrated leadership. Now, leadership is a competency where there's lots of different types of examples you could use. Leadership might be, again, like if there's a group has no direction, it's stepping in and taking the lead. Leadership could also be helping a more junior person, like mentoring or coaching and developing a more junior person. Leadership could also be standing up to something that you believe in and taking a stand that's perhaps not a popular decision. That might be an example of standing up and telling someone, reporting someone for being, if they're being bullied or something like that. So it could be sort of taking a stand, demonstrating leadership like that. As you can see here, again, a couple of different ways that they could ask this question. And there probably could be another 20 examples. So a time when you've used your leadership skills, a time when you took a leadership role without actually the title, or a time when you took the lead during a difficult time. I'm just going to run through an example. This is just a made up one, but it gives you an idea of how to structure it. So the situation, in my recent position as a team leader of a customer service team, the company was going through a restructure and 5 people were made redundant or lost their jobs. So this meant that the extra workload was left to the rest of the team. People were working long hours, morale was low, and people were starting to make mistakes. My task as a more senior member of the team, I felt that I needed to help get the team performance back on track and to try and improve morale in the team, particularly because there were quite a few team members who were new and inexperienced. So these are the actions. So the first thing I did, I scheduled a meeting with the team and I encouraged everyone to brainstorm some ideas about how we could spread the workload. I showed appreciation for their hard work during what has been a difficult time and thanked them for that. And I also asked everyone if they had ideas. I encouraged everyone that, this was a brainstorming meeting. I made it clear that no ideas were stupid and everyone should feel comfortable. So that's about being inclusive. I wrote all the ideas on a whiteboard and I suggested that we vote for the best 5 ideas. I then assigned each person to look into these ideas to see if they could go ahead and implement them to improve our situation. So you'll notice all the I statements there, and they're all strong I action statements. I scheduled, I showed appreciation, I asked, I made it clear, I wrote the ideas, and I assigned each person. Okay, the results were that the team responded really well to the meeting. They really liked the idea of having some input. Straight away, we came up with 2 ideas and they were implemented quickly, which saved a lot of time. The team stopped complaining and started to look for different ways of improving things. I also got great feedback from my manager for getting the team back on track. Obviously, you want to tell a story like this. It's in your words. It's got to sound natural to you, but you do want to try and use those strong action statements to show that you're the one who is taking the actions and implementing these things to improve things. Just another few more takeaways. Don't spend too long describing the situation. Keep it really succinct. Use I statements. We don't want we statements. And when you practice with, I find nearly all my clients just revert back to we. Nearly everyone says we, even people who work on their own. So when you practice, if you're practicing with someone, get them to stop you, okay? So when my clients say, oh, we did this, I say, who's we? Who was it, you or was it someone else? Oh, it was me. Okay, we'll say I. Okay, so it's really hard sometimes to do this, and people say, well, maybe it won't sound like I'm collaborative if I say I all the time. Okay, and so how you get around that is you say, well, I came up with this idea and I organized a meeting with my manager to see if he thought it was a good idea as well, rather than saying we had a meeting and decided. Okay, so it's, again, you taking the action. Obviously, when you were writing out your examples, list all the actions. I think it helps to put it in that bullet point format and bold them so that bold the beginning so that you remember what you're going to say. And in the results, if you can, it's great if you can quantify your results. Okay, so if you have worked in retail, for example, in part-time work, and you've got results of your sales figures or how you've helped the team increase their results, definitely include that, or if you've received specific feedback. So I know a lot of people don't have quantifiable results. But if you do, make sure you try and include them. Then the practice, okay? So you're going to draft your answers in the STAR structure. You're going to write them down. You're going to read them aloud and time yourself. One other way of doing it, you could record yourself saying it how you want it to sound and then play it back to yourself. Okay, so you might play it back in the car, play it back. It depends really how you learn. So I know I'm someone who learns more by listening rather than reading. So if I'm going to do a presentation, I will record myself saying it and then I'll listen back to how I want it to say, how I want it to sound. So think about, I guess, if you're all studying and, you've done years of study. So think about how you learn best. And another obviously great way is to collect some questions and team up with a friend or a family member and just practice asking yourself questions, asking each other questions and getting used to being put on the spot. I think that's the hardest thing for people, just sort of getting used to really listening to the question, identifying what competency they're testing, and then actually hearing yourself explain these stories. So often people find, a lot of these things you just do, you're not used to telling people how you do them. And that's the trick. So one of my favorite quotes, you might have heard me say this before, some of you, but the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. I promise you, if you do all this practice leading up to the interview, it will feel much better on the day. And it will also reduce your nerves. If you feel like you've pretty much anticipated every possible question, you've got a response for every question, then you shouldn't need to feel nervous. Okay, it's when people rock up, haven't prepared, haven't thought about what they're going to be asked, that's when you need to be nervous if you haven't done the prep. And finally, at the end of the interview, they will ask you, do you have some questions? I think I mentioned this before, think about some questions that will just get them, have some good two-way conversation. Obviously, you don't want to ask questions about things that have already been talked about. That's embarrassing. You don't want to ask questions where you can just get the information from the website. The idea is to build some rapport with the panel. Get them talking about themselves. Most of them love talking about themselves. Get them talking about the team, the work the projects that they've worked on, the highlights in their career. If you're interviewing with accounting firms, law firms, they love talking about the things that they do. And finally, practice what you're going to say at the end. Okay, so you'll ask a couple of questions and then they'll say, well, do you have any more questions? So write a little spiel for what you're going to say at the end. So, thank them for their time, perhaps mention a couple of interesting things that have come up in the discussion, and actually tell them that you're really interested in the role and why you feel like you'd be a good candidate. So many times people just leave an interview and the panel doesn't really know whether you actually want the job or not, because people feel like they've got to really be guarded and not express interest and enthusiasm. But just remember, one of those key things that they are assessing is, do you actually want the job? And they want to give that job to someone who really wants to be there. So don't feel like you have to hold back. If you are really excited and interested, then it's okay to tell them that. If you are, and I guess often a way to sort of finish the interview would be to ask, what the next steps might be or when you might be able to expect to hear back. Usually, I guess, with graduate processes, there's a fairly clear timeline. But if you're going for an interview, perhaps with a smaller company, and it's not sort of a part of a program, you could ask them, when could I expect to hear back from you if I'm successful? And what that does, it does give you a bit of a time frame to work with, so that if they were to say, look, we'll make a decision by Friday next week, come Friday or Monday or Tuesday the next week, it would be fine to give them a call or send an email and just check in on what's happening with the process. You don't want to be left hanging, waiting and wondering what's happened with that job. Now, after the interview, you could always send, if they've given you their details, like a business card, you could send an email and thank them for their time and express your interest in the role. Do get someone to proofread it. The last thing you want to do is have a great interview and then send a follow-up note with lots of spelling mistakes, and that will undo all your good work. So you don't have to do this. I think it depends on the organisation and how if it's quite a small company and it feels quite an intimate interview and they've given you their details. If it's, perhaps part of a wider program, it will really depend on the situation and whether you think that's appropriate. But again, you can thank them for their time, mention a couple of things that you're excited about, and reinforce your interest again. I've probably done enough talking. Does anyone have any questions?
I just had a quick question about when preparing for the behavioural interviews. I know one that's going to come up for me is going to be sort of addressing one of my weaknesses. And I was just wondering what the best way to sort of tackle one of like the negative questions would be, and if there was any particular strategy to sort of go about preparing for that.
Yeah, for sure. So do you mean how do you actually handle the question, what is your weakness? Is that what you mean? Or
yeah, basically, and in a behavioural format. So perhaps maybe like, tell us about a time where you did something wrong, or you identified a weakness in yourself, something along those sorts of lines.
Yeah, okay. So that's exactly right. So that it could be a general question. So they might say, tell us about a weakness or an area for improvement. The reason they ask that question is to see if you're self-aware. Okay, so no one wants to hire someone who doesn't have any weaknesses. So what you want to do is think about a weakness that is perhaps a real weakness, but not something that's going to stop you from getting the job. Okay, if they want a team player and you say you hate working with people, then that's not a good weakness to share. Okay, So often it's a weakness. It might be like a personality trait that is something that's always just felt a little bit harder for you. So for example, my weakness would be that I'm not a natural planner. Okay, I'm more of a go with the flow every day. So for me, I have to really, like in terms of goal setting and stuff, it's not really my jam. So if I was applying for a job where there was a lot of long-term planning, that would be something I would have to work at. Okay, so for me, it might be saying, I'm not someone who loves planning ahead, but, through my university studies, I've had to be a lot better at that. I've had to be really planning ahead and working out, how much time I need to study for exams. So this is something I've really worked at. And the way I've done this, I've started using a calendar. I write a weekly to-do list. I also write a daily to-do list. I set up a bit of a project plan in Excel and I color code it. So you could explain like what you're already doing to work on that.
Well, no, thanks, Maz. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, thanks for all this.
So that's the weakness. And look, it could be a personality trait. Like if you're going for a job, and you're a bit of an introvert, like you might say, look, I am a little bit introverted. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer to sort of feel comfortable speaking up in a group. But, once I get to know people, I really, I feel fine just contributing. It's just when I first start in a new job, and that might be seen as a weakness. So if you're going for a job in design or engineering or something where that, it doesn't really matter. They don't care if you're an introvert or an extrovert. But if you're going for a sales job, then, that wouldn't be a good weakness. So that would be more of a general question. You could get a behavioural question where they say, tell us about a time when you've made a mistake. Okay, and so the competency that they're assessing there is accountability. Are you willing to take responsibility? If you make a mistake, will you take responsibility? Will you communicate to the person about the mistake, anyone that you need to? Will you try and do everything you can to fix it? But most importantly, do you learn from it? What did you learn from making that mistake? And what have you done differently since so that it doesn't happen again? Everyone makes mistakes. So you definitely want to have an example where you have made a mistake. What's important is that you own it and you learn from it. So that's a mistake one. Another type of question like that is, tell us about a time you've received negative feedback. So again, same sort of thing. Are you open to feedback? How do you receive it? Do you reflect on it? What do you do to work on that feedback to improve yourself? They're tricky ones if you haven't prepared for them. We might finish up. Thank you for all joining in. Thanks for your questions. Feel free, to contact me via LinkedIn if there's something that you really want to ask me that you didn't feel comfortable asking tonight. So Thank you, everyone. I hope you all got something out of that, and good luck for your next interview.